Hello everyone, welcome back to the Real Canadian Liberal Podcast. This is the podcast where we look at the world from a real liberal lens. I'm talking a John Locke, John Stuart Mill lens, not the socialist monstrosity that masquerades as liberalism these days. Real liberalism. It's about liberty and freedom, civility and human rights. Not the socialist monstrosity we're used to hearing called liberalism these days. I'm Stu Stadinger. I'm your host. I'm a retired British and Canadian military officer, and I'm an applied scientist and regenerative rancher here in central Alberta. And I want to just say, the last video I did came across a bit stilted. I was kind of scripted in it, and I thought, I'm just going to wing it a little bit more on this one and see how that turns out. Perhaps it'll be a little bit easier to listen to. But what I want to do is I want to talk to you about a reply to a tweet that popped up last week. A member of the Provincial Parliament of Ontario put out a tweet talking about the third wave, but he had a picture of a Nazi uniform from the back, so he's making an analogy, third wave, Third Reich, and the Premier of Alberta responded. So I'm just going to bring that tweet up and read it to you, just so you can see what it said. Premier Kenney responded, "This is vile. There is and should be a vibrant debate about how best to deal with the pandemic. But equating the public health measures of democratically elected and accountable governments to the genocidal anti-Semitism of the Nazi Third Reich is odious and bonkers." So, Premier Kenney thinks that this whole statement was odious and bonkers. Well, let's have a discussion about that, shall we? Is it a vile comparison? I mean, if it's a vile comparison, then his point is valid. But we need to discuss what makes it a vile comparison. Well, it depends on a couple things. It depends on whether there's actually been a vibrant debate on COVID-19 policy, whether there is one right now. It also depends on whether that democratically elected and accountable government has actually made these policies and actually decided on them and followed the due process of law that they're supposed to follow to put in any policy that violates human rights under the Canadian or international charters, and follow the due process that keeps them accountable. He says they're democratically elected and accountable. And we also have to look at, was Randy Hillier's tweet about rabid anti-Semitism, or was it just a general statement about authoritarian governments exceeding their legal boundaries and violating human rights without following the due process of law? Because one could read it that way as well. So is it odious and bonkers? Well, perhaps we have to look at whether Alberta has actually had a vibrant debate, whether the vibrant debate has happened at all. Because he's talking about managing a pandemic. Have we had a vibrant debate about how to manage a pandemic? Well, that's a rather good question. Perhaps we should talk about that for a bit. He's making a presupposition that we've got a pandemic that's serious enough to justify any or all of the government non-pharmaceutical interventions that they've used. We've used, for example, asymptomatic quarantine. Well, a Portuguese court ruled in November last year that asymptomatic quarantine is a human rights violation. And why is that? Because the science says asymptomatic transmission isn't a thing. The Chinese did a study last year in Wuhan province. 10 million people in the study, not one case. Now, pre-symptomatic transmission might be a thing, but there's the study with the highest transmission rate for pre-symptomatic transmission that I can find says that you need 135 pre-symptomatic cases in a household setting, so that's long periods of exposure, touching the same things in the kitchen, all that kind of stuff, to get one transmission. That's an R number of 0.007. It's a long way below 1. So that is obviously not a driver of infection rate. So, asymptomatic quarantine, which is happening across Canada, is quite clearly a human rights violation, and the Portuguese quite rightly ruled against it. Let's see what else. We've got Austria and Belgium and Finland. Their courts have all ruled that their non-pharmaceutical interventions are unconstitutional. Unconstitutional, for everyone that doesn't understand, means they're violating charter rights, because their constitutions are very similar to ours. And they're also signatories to the international charters that we are. Most of them, if not all of them. It means that they're human rights violations. We need to understand that. And not only are they human rights violations, but because they're being done against entire populations, that's called a crime against humanity. It's not a war crime. There's not a war going on. It's a crime against humanity. That's what their ruling is. That's 3 Western advanced countries who have very similar law to ours have ruled that. So where's the debate? They've managed to do it. We haven't. There's only 2 ways that a government in Canada is permitted to breach someone's constitutionally guaranteed charter rights. The Canadian Charter, the International Charter. And that is, 1, during the prosecution of a crime through the courts of law, through the justice system. That is the due process of law required to suspend someone's rights. For example, incarcerate someone for a crime. And the only other way they can do it is in an emergency. A war, a pandemic, for example. And the due process of law in that is in Section 1 of the Canadian Constitution, in the Charter of Rights. In that charter, there must be a clear public justification. It must be clear and ascertainable according to the Constitution. So it means it must be written out in a fashion that most people can figure out and understand. Can't be ambiguous. Can't be a generic law that was passed years ago and just give someone some arbitrary power. It has to be clear and unambiguous. And not only that, it has to be voted on by the legislature. Because it's not law unless it is written down clearly and then voted on by the legislature. And then it is prescribed by law, according to the Section 1 of the Constitution. That's the first requirement. The second requirement is that it must be reasonable and justified in a free and democratic society. And how do we determine whether it's reasonable and justified? Well, it needs to be assessed against things like scientific evidence, etc., in a court of law using the Oakes test. That's how we do it in Canada. That's a precedent set back in the 1980s, just after the Charter was brought in. That's how we're supposed to do it. So we need to look at this. Do we have a pandemic worth or that justify all these measures? Well, if we were living in 2006, this wouldn't even be a pandemic, according to the definitions of the day. Why? Because pre-2008, the definition of pandemic was that there was a disease that was highly transmissible, going around the world and affecting a large proportion of the world's population. Fair enough. But it also had to have an impact. It had to have a significant level of impact on society due to sickness and death. And there were numbers against that. It had to have an infection fatality rate above X, case fatality rate above Y, right? Had to have impact. It had to have a significant negative impact on society. And then in 2008, because of a bunch of lobbying by corporate special interests, they took out the impact requirement. So now we have a hypothetical situation where we can have a new bug come out. It could arrive, I don't know, let's say from right here in Alberta tomorrow. It could transmit all over the world in a matter of 2 months and give 6 billion people a case of the sniffles for 2 days. No one gets seriously ill. They don't even feel that sick. They just have the sniffles. No one goes to hospital. No one dies. But because it's affected 6 billion people, according to the current definition, that'd be a pandemic that we all have to be concerned about. It could disappear in 3 months. No one dies. No one goes to hospital, but we got a pandemic. So, do we have a pandemic that is worth us suspending fundamental human rights for? Well, let's have a look and see what Alberta has experienced. Because Alberta has seen this. Since 2001, this is Stats Canada data. I pulled the data and I plotted it myself. I've got an honours degree in aeronautical engineering. This does not require calculus. This is a simple graph. If you take the Stats Canada data on excess mortality and you plot it, this is what you get. This is the deaths per million per day. So this is corrected for population change over the last 20 years. The deaths per million per day in 2020 peaked out at a rate 32% lower than the peak death rate, excess mortality rate in 2018. 32% lower. Now, it was a broader curve. It wasn't quite as sharp. But the point was that was the peak. And it's the peak that overwhelms your healthcare system. We've had 6 of these since 2001. In the last 20 years, 6 of equivalent mortality rate in deaths per million per day in Alberta. Let's have a look. Just for a comparison with Spanish influenza. Everybody talks about, oh, this is a once-in-a-century thing, Spanish influenza. Well, if we take 2020 mortality curve for Alberta and translate it into the deaths per million per day mortality rate from 1918 Spanish influenza, this is what we get. We get a death per million per day excess mortality rate 10 times that of COVID-19. 10 times. And it's even worse than that, because if you take it in life years lost, so the number of life years lost for every victim, it's not even close to being comparable. COVID-19 has killed people who have less than a year of life expectancy left. Now, I'm not saying it's not tragic. If someone dies early, whether it's 1 month early or 20 years early, it's tragic. It's really hard on the family. It's hard on everyone involved. When you lose a loved one, it's hard. It doesn't matter why it happens or when it happens. So we cannot get away from the fact that there's tragedy involved. But here's the reality. In 1918, the average age of death was 28, and the life expectancy was 58. They lost 30 life years for every death. These were young people in the prime of life, young fathers, young mothers. And here's the problem. That tells us that Spanish influenza, in terms of its impact on society, was 420 times worse than COVID-19. 420 times worse. So are we experiencing a particularly bad pandemic, one that justifies violating everyone's human rights? Well, it would seem no, seeing as we've had a peak mortality rate equivalent to 2020 6 times since 2001. I would suggest that it's not that bad. Not only that, this virus gives us an advantage in management over and above seasonal flu, because seasonal flu kills a much broader sector of the population than COVID-19. COVID-19's high-risk group is very focused. They are elderly people who are comorbid in the vast majority of cases. And guess what? Our healthcare system knows who all the elderly people is and who has the comorbidities. So they're easy to find and protect. But what didn't we do? We didn't protect them. What we did was we locked down all of the low-risk, young, healthy people. And rather than maximizing the relative transmission rate between the low-risk people and the high-risk people, we minimized the relative transmission rate between those two groups, therefore, in effect, increasing the infection rate amongst the most vulnerable. And Canada ranks 30th out of 30 of the world's most affluent countries in protecting the vulnerable demographics. Last. We're dead last of the top 30. We didn't protect them. We had more people die than necessary. How many more? Out of 22,000 deaths in Canada? Somewhere in that region? Probably 15,000 of them have been unnecessary. Maybe less, maybe more, but that's probably a pretty good figure if you look at what we could have achieved had we focused our protection on the most vulnerable. And we didn't. Instead, what did we do? We locked down the people for whom there was almost no risk. If you're under the age of 20 in Canada, more people got struck by lightning last year than died of COVID. If you live in Calgary last year, and you're under the age of 60, you are more likely to be murdered than die of COVID-19. If you're under the age of 40 in Canada, you take more risk driving to work in the morning than you do than the risk of getting a COVID infection. That's how minor this disease is for the vast majority of people. It's insane. So here we go. We're now in a situation where we have to look at, have we followed the due process? Have we justified it? Because I've already highlighted the fact that it's not a particularly serious disease for most viewpoints. And if we talk about that, talking about a free debate, Dr. John Ioannidis from Stanford University, he is the most highly ranked life scientist ever in history, has a H-index score of 196. He said publicly last April 2020, that this virus had an infection fatality rate comparable to seasonal flu, a bad seasonal flu. He was pilloried in the press. Literally everyone was saying, oh, this guy's a quack. The world's most highly ranked life scientist was considered a hack. By who? Bunch of media hacks who don't know anything about science? This guy with the British Medical Journal calls him the scourge of bad science. He's the top. And his colleagues, Michael Levitt, who's a Nobel laureate at Stanford, and Jay Bhattacharya, and Martin Kulldorff from Harvard, and Dr. Sunetra Gupta from Cambridge, an absolutely brilliant epidemiologist, and Dr. Carl Hennigan, the director of the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine, Oxford Medical School. These people have all looked at this stuff, and they all have very similar conclusions. And everyone ignores it. Where's the debate on that? How come our government hasn't talked to any of these people? We have professors at the University of Alberta who have said the same thing, and there has been no debate in public. None. So how have we justified taking all these actions when we haven't even talked to the scientists who have the data and have done the calculating? They've done all the work. No one's talked to them. You never see him on Global or CBC. You certainly never see the Premier talking to him. Have we ever seen a round table where we've got Alberta Health Services bureaucrats talking to these scientists to find out what the facts are? No. They're just making stuff up, as far as I can tell, because they certainly haven't got any science behind them. So, due process. Has this been voted on? Have these measures been voted on by the legislature? No, they haven't. Have they gone through a reasonable limiting assessment by a Supreme Court? No, they haven't. That means these measures are illegal, and their enforcement is illegal. It means someone enforcing these measures right now in Alberta or anywhere in Canada is breaking the law. They are committing a criminal act. This is criminal activity. But it's not just that. Right? Jason Kenney, the Premier, and I hope he's listening, claims that Randy Hillier's analogy is vile, odious, and bonkers. Rogue governments breaching human rights legislation without following due process? Seems a half-decent analogy to me, potentially, because it's caused massive collateral damage. Let's have a talk about the damage, shall we? By the end of last year, just due to the downstream effects of lockdowns in the Western world, around the world, under the age of 12, children in Africa, we starved 1 million to death. 1 million children starved to death. We took the world's population of people facing food insecurity from 135 million to nearly 300 million in the last year. 300 million people facing starvation. The World Food Program estimates now that the total starvation death toll to COVID-19 lockdown measures, the downstream effects of lockdown measures, will reach 36 million. That's 10 times higher than the COVID death rate is likely to be. It's over 3 times higher than the cost of the Nazi Holocaust from World War II. How's that for an analogy that fits with Randy Hillier's little picture? That's one of the costs. That's just one of the costs of the measures we've taken. And we in Alberta have contributed to that by not following due process, by not following the science, by not having a debate. Suicides are up. I talked to a guy today. He said 4 friends commit suicide in the last year. Overdoses through the roof in Alberta, across the Western world. 25% of Americans under the age of 20 have considered suicide in the last year. 25%. Industrial concentration is up massively. The single biggest contributor towards wealth inequality anywhere on earth, regardless of government, regardless of economic system, is industrial concentration, where all of the business in a particular economic sector is in the hands of a few large corporations. It's called industrial concentration. That's where wealth inequality comes from. And it doesn't matter whether it happens in a communist country or a capitalist country, a free market country or a corporatist country. It has no effect whatsoever. It's just industrial concentration. You can have it in any country on earth. So what we've done, as the World Health Organization, Dr. Navarro has already said, we've made the poor poorer and the rich richer. In huge amounts. How's that helping society? There's another thing we need to talk about. Social fabric. We've torn social fabric to bits. We've got people biting each other's heads off about wearing masks. Let's talk about masks for a second. Up until last year, we had 15 randomized controlled trials, or cluster randomized controlled trials, peer-reviewed and published on the use of masks against respiratory viruses. That's adenoviruses, rhinoviruses, coronaviruses, and influenza viruses predominantly. ILI, influenza-like illnesses. 15. And there are 2 outstanding. There's one in India and one in Guinea-Bissau that are due to publish this year. But that's the entire world's literature on the subject. And for all those disposable masks, your KN95s, your medical masks and everything else, there is no statistical benefit to wearing those masks in public. None in the science. And if someone, Dr. Fauci or anybody else, says that there is a benefit, they're lying. It's not in the literature. It's not there. It's anti-scientific, medieval, superstitious nonsense. But there is something that isn't superstitious nonsense. The one study on cloth masks started in 2009, completed, peer-reviewed, and published in 2015 in the British Medical Journal, recorded a 300% increase in infection rates for the use of cloth masks over not wearing any mask at all for respiratory viral infections. That's a 3 times increase. And what do we see all over society right now? People wearing cloth masks. They're increasing infection rates by wearing those masks. And Alberta Health Services has done nothing to warn people. I know of one business who has warned their customers that those things are an increased risk. One. Mine. I've never seen it in any other business. And if you don't warn somebody about something that is potentially risking their health or their life, that is a Canadian Criminal Code violation under Section 219, brackets 1, the Canadian Criminal Code. It's criminal negligence. And yet what we have people out there screaming, oh, you must wear a mask, you have to wear a mask, oh, they're like manhandling people out of stores and everything else. It's insanity, because they don't do anything. They're as useful as handing vitamin C to a wounded soldier on the battlefield. They don't do anything. And yet we've got society tearing itself apart about freaking masks, about a 30-cent piece of paper. That's a massive cost. It will take years for that animosity to go away. That's a very significant societal cost, building that level of animosity over something that has no scientific benefit whatsoever. Zero. So let's have a look at this. Randy Hillier was talking about totalitarian governments not following the due process of law when they need or want or desire or whatever to violate fundamental human rights. That's what his analogy was about. And there aren't that many types of totalitarian government. There are a few. There are some broad categories. You could add or subtract religion or race onto any of these. But here's the broad categories. We got the old one, the one that hung around for a few thousand years. Right? You've got a small ruling elite exercising power through a hereditary aristocracy. It's called feudalism, or some variation on that theme. You got another one. It's a small ruling elite exercising power directly through the institutions of state. Stalinist USSR, Maoist China. A third one, a small ruling elite exercising power through the institutions of state and through corporate structures under the control of the government or party. Huh. National Socialist Germany, for example. Post-Maoist National Socialist China, i.e. China right now. Indistinguishable from National Socialist Germany in terms of their policy, in terms of the way their country is run. Oh, the fourth. A small ruling elite. We started to notice a pattern here. A small ruling elite exercising power directly through the institutions of state and through corporate structures under the control of syndicates influenced by government or party. Now, a syndicate, for those who don't know, is a super union. If you have an entire economic sector dominated by one union where membership is mandatory and there is no choice, that's a syndicate. Where do we find that in Canadian society? Oh, pretty common in the public sector. And what is a syndicate the basic building block of? Oh yeah, that's right. French and Italian fascism. Syndicalism is the primary building block of French and Italian fascism. So, Randy Hillier picked the wrong analogy. He picked number 3 when he should have picked number 4. Big deal. Oh, there's another form of government. There's the criminal government. It's basically where you got a criminal gang running the place. Yeah, got a few of them kicking around too. And variations on those themes. So, Randy Hillier picked the wrong totalitarian government. He picked a National Socialist corporate state rather than a fascist corporate state as an analogy to describe what's happening right here in Canada. Who cares? Really, who cares? When you've got a boot on your throat, do you really care whether it's a member of the Vasquez cartel that's got the boot there, or whether it's a Nazi? To the person with the boot on their throat, it doesn't matter who's got the boot on the throat, the boot's on their throat. To the people suffering under these totalitarian regimes all over the world, what difference does it make what their philosophy or whatever is? They're all evil, totalitarian regimes run by a small ruling elite for their own benefit. That's what they do. They have various excuses. Oh yeah, we're going to help the proletariat, create a great state. We're going to do X, Y, Z. We're going to create a racially pure state in the case of the National Socialists. Oh, we're going to create a Han Chinese super state in the case of the National Socialist Chinese. Whatever. They've all got excuses. But the reality is, it's a small ruling elite that just wants all the power to themselves. And we got a little bit of that bleeding through into Canadian society because our government has not followed the due process of law. And the decisions are not being made by the elected and accountable government. They're being made by the unelected and unaccountable bureaucracy. And they're not being restrained by law enforcement and the courts. They're being helped by law enforcement and the courts. This is the biggest breakdown in law and order in the British Commonwealth since the English Civil War. It's not good. So is it vile, odious, and bonkers? Well, Premier Kenney, if you're watching this, and you know who I am, you've met me and my wife on several occasions, you need to pay attention to this. Do I believe that you're a fascist? No, is the answer. I do not. So don't take that as an accusation. But what's happening in our province and in our country is being driven by people who are most closely linked to that ideology and live and work in structures that are identical to the structures that stem from that ideology. And the results that we're seeing are identical to what comes out of that ideology. And here's the problem. Even if it's not your fault, because you're the boss, it's your fault. It's your responsibility. Now, there's a great book written by a guy named Jocko Willink. Jocko and I served in Iraq at the same time. We never actually met each other, but he was a U.S. Navy SEAL lieutenant commander. He's written a book called Extreme Ownership, and he talks about leadership. And basic principle is this. It doesn't matter if it's your fault that something went wrong on your watch. If it went wrong on your watch, if you're the boss, it's your responsibility. Do I believe that you can fix this problem, Premier Kenney? Yes, I do. Quite clearly, you could fix this problem. You got to stand up against the special interests who would like this to carry on. Right? It became pretty obvious today with the Grace Life Church incident that there are people in the Alberta government who don't care about human rights, and they don't care about breaking the law, and they don't care about the due process of law. And they've got the RCMP doing their bidding, breaking the law while they're doing it. Can we fix it? Yeah, it can be fixed. Can you fix it? Well, it depends on whether you want to fix it, because who else is going to fix it? Because the leader of the opposition is all in. Breaking human rights legislation is a hobby for the opposition. It's what they do. It's part of their party platform. And the public sector that is involved in this is all in. They don't care about human rights. Tommy Douglas is rolling over in his grave. He may have been economically illiterate, but I'd take him right now over any of the other leaders in Canada. Alberta voted for you because you were the man that everyone expected to stand up against this sort of stuff. I supported you because I'm the father of a family that is mostly ethnic minority. And the only racism my wife has run into since she moved to Canada came from the NDP. And you had a reputation for being the guy who actually helped out oppressed people who were trying to escape from some tyrannical regime elsewhere in the world. That was your reputation. I was like, good. That's the guy we need. That's why I supported you. That's why my wife supported you, and you know her. Last time you saw her, you walked up to her and said, "Hi, Miriam," and then you said, "How are you doing?" in Arabic. Bit of a cheesy politician thing to do, but she didn't mind, we didn't mind, had a good conversation. It was an appreciated gesture, regardless of whether it was a bit cheesy. It doesn't matter. But here's the problem. What you don't know about my wife, Premier Kenney, is that when she was growing up, the government of the country where she grew up disappeared one of her uncles for 13 years. Disappeared. That's the stuff that happens in other parts of the world, where human rights are not protected, are not defended, and where the due process of law doesn't stand and isn't adhered to. And 8 weeks ago, she's talking to a friend on the phone, and I'm in the other room, and I overhear her say, "I thought I left this shit in the third world." Think about that. A woman who grew up in a country where the government disappeared her uncle for 13 years is sitting in Alberta and commenting to a friend, "I thought I left this shit in the third world." That's where we're at. So is Randy Hillier's analogy really all that vile? Is it really that odious? Is it really that bonkers when you think about it? Really? Here's the problem we have. I don't know if anybody knows who Bruno Day is, but Bruno Day, at 93 years old, last year was convicted of crimes against humanity. He was a camp guard at Stutthof concentration camp in Germany during the Second World War. He didn't actually kill anyone. He didn't commit any violent crimes himself. He was convicted because he failed to do enough to oppose what was going on. I'm not kidding you. That's what he was convicted for. That's what the prosecution said. He wasn't even a Nazi. He was drafted into the SS, so he wore the uniform, but he was forced into it. But he failed to do enough to oppose it. And he was convicted of crimes against humanity as a result. And right now, we have hired security, we have mall cops, we have RCMP, we have bylaw enforcement, peace officers, sheriffs, whatever. We have people who are just employed by Walmart and other stores, stood at the door, enforcing non-pharmaceutical interventions that have never been through the appropriate due process to make them legal. So everyone who's enforcing them is breaking the law. They're going along to get along. They're just following the rules. They're doing what Bruno Day did between 1942 and 1945. There was an 11-year-old girl left a comment in the guest book at Auschwitz that just said, "Where are all the good people?" Well, the fact is there weren't many. The German resistance only had 60,000 people in it, active. There were others who were active, or who were opposed it, but there weren't that many, because most people just followed the rules. They chose to be the gray, go along to get along person instead of being good. The good people weren't there, and right now the good people aren't here, or there aren't enough of them. Pastor James Coates from Grace Life Church got sent to prison for refusing to break the law. That's what people need to understand. He refused to break the highest law in this country. And he refused to break the constitutional or the charter law of international law that we are signatories to. The very law that we send our military off to enforce in other parts of the world. He refused to break that. And he went to prison for it. Kind of reminiscent of Dietrich Bonhoeffer during the Second World War. Pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who unfortunately was killed about 3 weeks before the end of the Second World War by the Gestapo. And I sincerely hope that our government has no plans to do the same to Pastor Coates. But everyone who's calling on the Alberta government to go and shut down that church, they've had almost no infections. They've got 350, 400 people rub shoulders every Sunday. Every Sunday. And since June last year, they've had 2 minor cases. The threat is minimal. In a normal year, you'd have more sickness from a group that size who met every Sunday. They are not a threat to society. But society is a threat to them. And a society that is a threat to them is a threat to all of us. It's a threat to my family, a threat to my wife. This is the Queen's Commission. I have 2 of them, but this is the one that is extant. People who hold this have a very serious duty to resist manifestly unlawful commands and orders, as the Canadian Queen's Regulations and Orders say. Now, the Queen's Regulations that I have to follow have very similar wording. The officers of the RCMP have that same commission, and they have that same duty. And if they're not living by that commission, if they're not living by that duty, and if they're not following that law or that regulation in Queen's Regulations and Orders, we are in big trouble as a society. So, what needs to happen? Well, a number of things need to happen, but the due process of law needs to come back. The government needs to start obeying the law. They need to get back in the lane of civilized nations. And Premier Kenney is the Johnny on the spot. If he's listening, he's the boss. It's his responsibility. It's his responsibility to get this government back inside the law. And then to do whatever it takes spend whatever budget needs to be spent to get the right team together, get the justice minister together, to get the right investigators together, to go out and find those responsible for dragging this province and this country outside the law, for committing all of these illegal violations without following due process, to find the people behind that and the people who have convinced everyone that this is a horrific, terrible disease, which for most people it isn't. It's a very minor illness. For the people who have done all that, they need to be pursued. They need to be found, they need to be investigated, they need to be sat in front of a jury of their peers, and they need to face the music. That's what needs to happen. And the leader who does that will probably be hated by a whole bunch of people. But you know what? When you're hated by fascists, who cares? It means you stood for something good. Are they all fascists? Oh, they might not be, but they're all totalitarians. Most of them are fascists, by the technical definition of Giovanni Gentile and Benito Mussolini. But here's the issue. They need to face justice. We as a society should not wait until they're 93 years old like Bruno Day before they face justice. They need to face justice now. And the people of Alberta deserve that to happen, because this province has stood for human rights and civil liberties and civilized behavior for a very long time. We have sent thousands of our young people over the last 150 plus years to risk their lives and die to protect these rights and liberties. Freedom isn't free. I've buried 7 friends and colleagues in my military career. I didn't literally bury them myself. I didn't get to the funerals of a couple of them because I wasn't even there. But they're people that I served with who died in the service of this law, of this legal tradition where nobody, the Queen, the Parliament, the judicial system, no one's allowed to break that law without following due process. It's a tradition that's 800 years old in this country. And 7 of my friends and colleagues died for it, 3 of whom were fathers of young children. And I would rather not bury any more. I would rather that someone stood up and stopped this, got this province out of this problem. Because this is not a free liberal democracy we're living in right now. It's just not. And a free liberal democracy is what my children deserve, and what your children deserve. People in Alberta deserve. Because a vaccine passport is not how you get freedom. You get freedom because my friend Chris burned to death in a helicopter in 2004. That's how freedom's bought. It's very expensive. And he's not the only one. That's where freedom comes from. It comes from the people who carry these, having the guts to do what it takes to defend the law and the due process of law under which we live, under which this government and the Queen and the judicial system is accountable. So if we want a free and democratic and accountable society, as Premier Kenney claims that we are, we got some work to do, because we're not there now. Anyway, I've said enough. I'll leave you with that. I'll let you have a think. Let you consider what I've said. For the Real Canadian Liberal podcast, I'm Stu Staudinger. Have a good evening.